Friends, some time ago I had commenced a series of talks on essays rather than books. And I think I discussed about 6 or 8 essays, abandoned that series about a year ago, and I now seek to resume that. The essay I want to take up today is a contemporary essay rather than a classic essay such as the ones that I've discussed last year, including essays by people such as George Orwell. This essay is called Our Technology Sickness and How to Heal It. And its author is Micah Goodman. The essay was published, I think, sometime around 2023. I think it's an enormously interesting essay, although, as I will suggest, I think eventually the author of this essay was a philosopher, a Jewish philosopher who lives in Israel and Jerusalem, perhaps divides his time between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, as many people do in Israel, particularly academics. But I was about to say that there is a fatal problem in the essay towards the very end, but notwithstanding that, I think it's an extremely interesting read, a provocation. So he begins, of course, with the premise that we do have a technology sickness. Many people will say a technology addiction. And when there is an addiction, whether it's to alcohol or tobacco or drugs, then sometimes people look for a cure for it. Are we looking for a cure to our technology sickness? And do we agree with the premise that there is a technology sickness? I'm not going to here dispute that premise. I think that there is a modern obsession of a certain kind with technology. And of course, there is a massive social commentary, which we see in newspapers, in everyday conversations about the addiction of lots of people to various forms of technology, particularly what is now called social media. Right? So let's just run with the premise that there is an issue here. And the question is how to think through it. Now, he's a Jewish philosopher. Micah Goodman is a Jewish philosopher. And he begins by saying that, look, he has grown up with the Talmud. And unfortunately, from his point of view, we're living in an anti-Talmudic world. Because what is it that the Talmud, that is the holy scriptures for Jews, what is it that the Talmud teaches Jewish people? It teaches them, according to Micah Goodman, that there are always multiple perspectives on nearly every fundamental issue. And the Talmud instructs him, this is his understanding of his own tradition, that one should grapple with all sides of the dispute. One should attempt to understand the perspective of those who have a point of view which is different from us, particularly if it's radically different from us. But the tradition doesn't say that we should accept all points of view as equally valid, nor does it say we should attempt to live with all of them. All of us who adhere to a certain point of view, even when we recognize, many people, of course, fail to recognize, or even if they do recognize, fail to engage with another point of view. But all of us who do, in fact, actually engage with another point of view, eventually decide that they're going to live with a certain point of view, which is often the point of view that they started with. There are some people who come around to a different point of view after a long engagement with advocates of another point of view, right? But what he says is the Talmud says you must consider all of these perspectives and then live your life in accordance with one of those perspectives. Now, Goodman then proceeds to say that we are living in an anti-Talmudic world because of, let me use that cliched word which is used everywhere, because of the extreme form of polarization that has crept into nearly every society. It has certainly crept into the United States, where people often speak of two different nations. They say that, well, the people who live in California and New York and New England and perhaps Chicago, or maybe a couple of other places, some university, towns, as it were, like Austin, Texas, they all constitute, in a manner of speaking, one nation. And then the large swaths of the United States, which are marked as red, not communist red, but red in the American register of things here, i.e., they're Republican, right? Extremely conservative, that these are two separate nations. So this is what we mean by polarization. Just as there's a polarization, one could argue, between those who advocate for Hindutva in India and those who advocate for what might be described very roughly as a kind of liberal secular dispensation, or just being decent, frankly, because from their point of view, the Hindutva people are not even decent, really, most of the time. Their trolls, for example, are really vicious, right? So that's the form of polarization that we're speaking of. And he says that we're living in an anti-Talmudic world because we live almost invariably now an echo chamber. That is, that the books we read, the people we speak to, the people we converse with, the people we seek to seek out as friends, right? The videos and films that we watch, all of these tend to be now produced by people who share our own perspective. That's the echo chamber. So we're only hearing ourselves. And in that sense, it's an anti-Talmudic world because we are not hearing people with a different perspective. Of course, I could argue, although I don't think that that in any ways negates at all his point of view, that when he says that the Talmudic world has given him this injunction to think about different perspectives. Well, I don't think it's only the Talmud that does that. If you were a Jain, the Jain philosophy of Anekanantavad, right, which is the multi-perspectiveness of reality, is precisely about that. And yet the Jains are very clear that they're going to live their lives according to a certain perspective, right? Now, he says something very interesting before I move on to the whole question of technology, although I've already now given a bit of an intimation of where technology comes in, because I suggested that for someone like Goodman, we are living in an anti-Talmudic world because the books we read, often, by the way, on a device, increasingly on a device, the films we watch, etc., right? And the people with whom we share texts and messages, whether on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok, all of this, of course, these are all forms of technology, right? And these forms of technology that we deploy and what we hear and what we see, they only echo views that we already hold. And their effect is to, in fact, further consolidate those views rather than weakening them, which would be the first step towards some kind of serious dialogue, right? But anyhow, Micah Goodman says, that there was a book written by Robert Putnam, who taught at Harvard University, perhaps still does, a book published in 2020. The book is called The Upswing: How We Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. So Putnam set himself the task of trying to understand why America had now gravitated towards this extreme forms of polarization. And he says, and Goodman is now telling us what Putnam has argued, gives that in the 1950s, Americans were asked whether they would be bothered if their son or daughter married a person of a different race. About 50% said yes, they would be bothered if their ward, their son or their daughter, married a person of a different race. They were also asked if their son or daughter uh, 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 married a person who was affiliated with a different political party rather than belonging to a different race. How many of them would be bothered? Only 10% would be bothered. Now, the same questions were posed 6 decades later in the 2010s. Fewer than 10% of the people said they would be bothered if their son or daughter married a person of a different race. Okay. I don't incidentally believe that, but let's put that aside. I believe that in the sense that I think that today the number of people who would say that they would be bothered if their son or daughter married a person of a different race, I think would be considerably higher than 10% in the United States, right? But let's just go with what Putnam found out, what his survey revealed. But interestingly, over 50% of the people in the 2010s, okay, said it would bother them if their child married a person with opposing political views. So what's happened in those 6 decades? The situation has been entirely flipped. People would be far more bothered today by the fact that their son or daughter had married a person of different opposing political views, and race would not be much of a consideration, right? And he's, of course, this is the basis on which now he argues, Goodman argues in part, that the fundamental problem is the problem of polarization, and technology has vastly deepened that problem, aggravated that problem, right? Now, here the question then is, how do we think about this sickness? Because the sickness he's speaking about now, it becomes clear, is not simply a matter of addiction. It's not simply a matter of people spending too much time, okay, watching videos on their device or spending too much time on social media. In a common sense reading, that might well be, in a common sense view, might be that that's part of the sickness too. But what he's really fundamentally interested in here is the whole question of how technology, in fact, actually reinforces certain dogmas and certain views, narrows the world, when in fact the world views that we have, when in fact these modern forms of technology were all introduced with the promise that they would help open the world up to us, right? That they would make us more capacious in our thinking, and that they would actually bring us together. Uh, Virtually all the major companies like Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, right? They've all essentially suggested that the usefulness of these technologies that they have come up with reside in the fact that they make possible certain forms of connectedness, interconnectedness, right? To use that cliche that we can all now become, you know, a global village, etc. And in fact, of course, the polarization that we find in the United States and in India, in Australia, and Poland, in so many countries, this polarization, in fact, suggests exactly the opposite that has really happened. All right. So from there, he moves on to uh, suggesting, echoing in this case Marshall McLuhan, of course, one of the probably the one of the most iconic public intellectuals in a way. The medium is a message, right? That phrase all goes back to him, and he had written, among other things, this influential book called Understanding Media, where he had suggested something, namely that, look, what technology gives, okay, attracts us. What it gives is something that is bright and shiny. But for everything it offers us, it also takes something away from us, right? What that is to say, let me put it in a different language, for every gain, right? So this young generation in particular tends to see all of the technology around them as a gain, right? Uh, Nobody really has a resounding critique of the computer, because almost everyone sees a computer as something that has been an extraordinary blessing. Here I'm speaking about the personal computer. people who are using the computer for email, for typing up, writing up their manuscripts, for storage of music, texts, and documents. Um, and people of this generation will say it's extraordinary, isn't it? That in a little chip of 2 terabyte, you could store a whole library equivalent to 100,000 books or perhaps more, right? And then there are easy methods of retrieval, apparently, from this point of view, right? So it's obvious what computers have given us. And McLuhan is saying, and Goodman in turn is saying that, that's a gain, perhaps, but for every gain, there is a loss. The loss is never evident to us. This is what the American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous thinker of the school that became known as Transcendentalism, described as a law of compensation, that there's a law of compensation. At work, we don't really recognize it, and that for every gain, there is something that is really a loss. Okay. So that's the first element of a critique of technology that we have to really begin to um, think about. All right. And from there he moves on to trying to consider what are the ways in which we can actually arrest some of the problems that have been thrown up by technology. So then he gets into the kind of arguments that I think we're more or less familiar with. So I've already mentioned the principal argument, which is an argument about what we might call the echo chamber. Now let's put a different element of it, that that when people use social media, for example, and they have a certain disposition, a certain way of thinking. What do they do? That when they go to the internet, when they go to social media, they filter out the points of view that cannot be reconciled with their own, right? And of course, the algorithms are also said that once you have used a search engine in a particular way, the search engine will then recognize your own predilections, and that's true of when you buy books. When you buy a certain kind of book, then Amazon, for example, same thing holds true for other vendors. You'll say, here's a list of other books that we think will interest you. Okay, so there's a filter that we can speak of that has already come in, which is now also in a way filtering out, all right, points of view and perspectives that evidently are not our own, right? So then he says, Goodman, that because of this digital revolution, our lives are being transformed by three grand bargains. The intellectual bargain. We have more knowledge but less capacity to concentrate and focus. Not a radically new argument. We've heard this. We have heard this argument that we have less of a capacity to be attentive. Okay, and in fact, this transits into a second bargain, the social bargain. We are much more available, but much less attentive. Right. So, being attentive, being able to concentrate, being able to focus. There's both a social and intellectual bargain, and most importantly, the emotional bargain, right? That recall that our lives are being transformed by these three bargains, right? We are much more connected, but much less empathetic. We are connected, that is to say, in a superficial way, in an exceedingly superficial way, which is why one marvels, and I certainly do, when I hear from someone generally much younger than myself, that they have 5,000 friends on Facebook. 5,000. I mean, that's extraordinary. How can anybody possibly have 5,000, quote, friends? Because certainly then their understanding of what a friend is very different than my understanding of a friend. It's a blessing if one has, let's say, a dozen very good friends in one's life, right? And there are so many people who don't even have one friend. So that is the emotional bargain. We are much more connected, but much less empathetic. Connected in that, yeah, there's superficial kind of engagement, if one even wants to call it that. One might have 10,000 addresses in one's Facebook, uh, you know, but do we have an empathy for those who are much less fortunate than us, for those who have witnessed a suffering or themselves undergone a suffering, and so forth and so on, right? And he's suggesting that this digital revolution, the technological revolution, has greatly aggravated these problems. These are the three bargains that we've entered into. So then what is to be done? And he suggests that we need less choice and we need more freedom. That choice comes to the detriment of the chooser. That the internet permits us this choice. You go to a supermarket and you're permitted a choice. This choice, however, is not simply superficial, right? But in a way, it occludes the fact that some fundamentally hard decisions that are made are always made with reflection, right? And that if we're thinking of the question of freedom, there is no way to really think through that question of freedom without also thinking of it dialectically. That is, that there is a relationship between freedom and restraint. So he suggests that, and then he invokes philosophers such as Spinoza, um, who had argued that happiness is not a function of being free, but of grasping that one is not free. All right. Um, this will take, of course, quite a bit of time to untangle, and we would have to really start looking into Spinoza. Um, uh, Secondly, and here he's now going back to the question of, because secondly, that is with regard to what is to be done. And now he's going back to the three bargains that we had entered into. He says that we need a cultural shift. We have to think far more about attention over availability, right? We have to think about uh, uh, wanting to we have to think about how we should be more loving rather than wanting to be loved. Okay, and there is a relationship here between attention. So when we seek attention, and in fact the present generation of those who are called influencers, it's all about seeking attention, seeking attention, right? And he's suggesting that we have to radically rethink the whether this will in fact make us happier and will deliver us from this technological sickness that he's really speaking about, right? And then in the third um, section of his remedies, and this is where I have a fundamental difference with him, he speaks about remedial technologies. Remedial technologies. So remedial, what do we mean by remedial technologies? It's quite transparent, and right, everyone thinks of it. That is that, look, one of the problems, let's take an illustration. One of the problems is people who are texting while they're driving, right? People who are even watching videos while they're driving. Okay. So a remedial technology would be a technology that you install in a vehicle that would prevent the driver from texting, from surfing the web, and so on and so forth. That's a remedial technology, right? And it sounds very reasonable, doesn't it? But what is the fundamental problem with it? The fundamental problem is simply this, that this is a technicist point of view. In other words, Goodman belongs to that school of thought which thinks that you can resolve the problems created by technology with technology, with better technology, right? And of course, we know that that's not the case, which is why we have this constant problem of computer updates, for example, that every week, the computer tells you an update is available. Well, why do we need an update every week? The system's working perfectly fine. And of course, the submission on the other side would be that no, you're not aware of the fact that hackers have now been able to find some way to infiltrate yet again for the 100th time or the 500th time, right? The computer system, so that all the technological fixes, those 500 technological fixes, all of them have now proven to be inadequate. And it's a constant cat and mouse game that the hackers come in, and then the hackers from the other side, who are hired to prevent the hackers from the other side, right, from being able to steal your data, exploit you, right? Send you messages saying that, well, we caught you watching pornography and you better shell out of $5,000, right? Some hacker has broken into your system, right? And then, of course, Microsoft and Apple, et cetera, what do? They try to find fixes, right? So Goodman, when he speaks about remedial technologies, yes, we can grant him the fact that he's not banking only upon this, but nevertheless, the very fact that he thinks that there are remedial technologies suggests to me that he is undermining his own argument in part, because that will not be an alleviation of our technological sickness. It will actually make our sickness worse. All things considered, however, this essay by this Jewish philosopher, I think, makes for an enormously interesting read.